Viewer discretion is advised for this video. More details can be found in the description. In 2013, the human race was blessed with Code Black, a documentary following the doctors of the LAC plus USC Medical Center Emergency Department. It was directed by Ryan McGarry and written by Ryan McGarry and Joshua Altman. I love the writing credits on documentaries. They really make me feel like I'm getting the coolest version of the truth. In particular, the documentary focuses on a space known as Cebu, a tiny room consisting of 2 beds with a smaller hall separating them from computers and other equipment. It's in this small room that the documentary opens, highlighting just how busy the department is. The doctors also discuss the medical center that was built after the 1994 Northridge earthquake, which, as well as this new building, led to new safety regulations in the hospital. Said regulations included a new system that classified patients with a rating of 1 to 4. In theory, this was to allow severely ill or injured patients to be treated before paperwork was completed, though in reality, new rules about insurance paperwork left patients in the congested ER waiting upwards of 14 hours to be treated. The documentary's title refers to a situation in which the ER has more patients than it does resources to treat them, something that I just shudder to think about, because working in retail almost killed me, and yesterday I almost fell out of bed when my cat farted. To me, being an overworked medical worker sounds like a sort of purgatory situation. The documentary actually did okay for itself, too, winning 3 film festival awards according to a section of its Wikipedia article with absolutely no attached sources. This being the case, and the landscape of television being what it is, it was perhaps inevitable that a medical drama would be inspired by the documentary. And what do you know? A medical drama named Code Black was greenlit by CBS in January of 2015. And whenever a new medical drama is greenlit, the gods flip a coin to determine whether or not the show will try desperately to be Grey's Anatomy.
What are you doing down here?
Just sitting here with my penis.
Code Black is a medical drama that aired on CBS between 2015 and 2018. The series follows the doctors of One Angels Memorial Hospital. In particular, it purports to be about the emergency department, the busiest ER in America. Angels Memorial ER goes into Code Black almost every night. Now, I'm willing to bet that you've watched a medical drama or 2 in your day, and if you haven't, you're likely at least familiar with the names of the more popular ones, much like cop shows and shows about firefighters, apparently. Medical dramas are a dime a dozen, and if you're not a fan of the genre, are probably going to be completely indistinguishable from one another. But I'm hoping that you're willing to sit down with me a while and talk about Code Black today, because I find it to be a fascinating use case of the soap opera-style melodramatic medical drama. I'll try to make this video as accessible as possible for people who haven't seen the show, don't worry. Musical number. The pilot opens with our new residents being told that this will be the hardest thing they ever have to do, and they better get their shit together and just try not to kill anyone. You know, like happens in medical dramas. In this case, the speech comes from ER nurse Jessie, nicknamed Mama. And we have all the other characters you'd expect too. There's Leanne, an intimidating but caring mentor, Rowley, a wise elderly doctor who gives sage advice, and even an army doctor who irritates me and I hate and is only propped up by the strength of his actor's performance, and I have very complicated feelings about Owen Hunt, okay? And speaking of, here I'm going to apologise because there's going to be quite a lot of Rob Lowe in this video. Sorry. Our residents include Mario, an outwardly cold, ambitious man who slowly opens up as he gets to know his co-workers, Angus, an anxious, gentle man who turns out to have great unexplored discipline, and Krista, a kind, blonde woman driven primarily by her empathy for her patient and... hold on. These are all clips from Grey's Anatomy, aren't they? I've referenced Grey's Anatomy a lot so far for such a small portion of the video, and depending on your feelings towards the show, that might be getting pretty annoying. The thing is, it's very easy to reference Grey's Anatomy when talking about medical dramas because, like I said, a lot of other shows in the genre seem to feel the need to treat Grey's Anatomy as reference point or a template, and I'd say that's without Grey's Anatomy being the best or most original show out there as it is, but if I do say that, I'll be shunned from the fandom. But as it is, I'm not going to keep making references to Grey's Anatomy because even though it could be helpful weaknesses with this show, there is one very specific comparison to Grey's Anatomy that I want to make later, and I'd like you to still have patience for me when I do that. The format of Code Black is fairly typical. Every episode we follow the doctors dealing with one or two cases in particular. Perhaps more of the episode centers on some kind of disaster. This case often somehow relates to an issue one or more of the doctors is facing at the time, thus teaching said doctor a lesson or leading to a personal revelation. Meanwhile, the doctor's personal arcs and relationships continue from episode to episode, along with political or bureaucratic bullshit going on around the hospital, which in this show I do find to be particularly uninteresting. So, for the most part, an episode introduces patients and then follows their journey throughout, resolving their story, this small chapter in their lives, by the episode's end. It's like a monster of the week, but with near-fatal accidents and terminal disease. It's not exactly an original formula for a show, but it also doesn't need to be. I've said before, and I will continue to say, that a piece of fiction doesn't need to be original as long as it takes what it's doing and does it really well. You could take the most bitch basic cookie-cutter template story and turn it into something great if you know what you're doing. Now, I don't know what footage I'm going to end up putting there, so I don't know if it's the kind of thing that will cause a stink in the comments, but Code Black is very standard. It can get a little bland, a little samey, but I think where it most shines is in the development of some of its characters and the relationship between them. Some of its characters. Others, I was going to mention earlier when I was listing characters, but then I didn't because I forgot their name. I've seen this show twice. You do have your event episodes, your disaster episodes, but there really is something to be said for simple, well-realized stories about the influence that people can have on each other in even a short amount of time. And that's especially true for shows of this type, I think. The best episodes of Code Black are those that do a really good job at the doctor/patient of the week formula and show the effect that treating said patient has on whichever member of the main cast is the focus of the episode. Or that take that well-trodden formula and twist it a little, turning it into something new and interesting. In fact, the episode I'm specifically referring to here is consistently rated among the best of the show. Code Black has its special events and disasters, but I just find those to be less memorable. I was sitting here trying to remember if the show's finale episode was like an earthquake or a plane crash or what it was. It's a plane crash. A plane crashes into the hospital. Of course it does. Where the hell else would it crash? I have to take a moment here, because to be absolutely fair to Code Black, it's not entirely its fault that its special event episodes aren't the most memorable of affairs. As I said, Code Black ran until 2018, and it does lean a little bit into the zone of scary unknown pathogen, and we have to quarantine half of the ER, and I don't know about you, but I'm a little numb to the threat of a pandemic. And they immunize people immediately with a creepy blood vaccine they make in a tent. So, it's alright for some. One of our original cast of residents is Dr. Angus Layton. When we're first introduced to Angus, he's clearly lacking confidence, and is perhaps the most openly doubtful that he's cut out to work at Angel, and not for no reason. We learn that Angus has long lived in the shadow of his older brother Mike, also an ER doctor, and is working at Angel's in an attempt to finally live up to him. But Angus also later confides that he only got the job at Angel's because his dad is a higher up at the hospital, and Angus asked him for it. Oh, and side note, look how fucking cool this room is, with the windows and the... I know this isn't a show about surgeons, except for when it is, but they do not utilize this room nearly as much as they should. It is hands down the best set in the show. At one point, Angus is approached and offered some Adderall by a surgical resident who says that she uses it to fuel her work performance. Angus tries it and is suddenly more confident and quick to act, though to the point that he acts out of character and worries his friends. Obviously, the reality is that Angus doesn't need to take anything to perform well in his job. The potential was inside him all along, or whatever. But knowing Angus's history and motivation, from a character perspective, I find this to be really interesting. I can believe that this is a choice that this character would make, and I'm into it.
It's great work by the team.
Angus, he's alive because you were prepared. You nailed that airway, man. I'm proud of you.
Well, I'm still working on taking a compliment, but thank you.
Well, whatever you're doing, just keep doing it. We're all noticing.
What is weird about this arc is that it's so short. One of the aspects of Angus's character is that he brings Mario out of his shell a little bit by befriending him, and Mario himself has a history of drug addiction. And while the two characters do briefly discuss the issue of Angus's addiction, they don't do so in any great depth, which is a shame. You know, I love friendship storylines, and I think that it would have been nice if the characters were allowed to do more with the situation than yell at each other for an episode. Not to reduce them to this one aspect of their character, just to explore the new aspect that this brought to their friendship. I don't know. Now I'm going to introduce Dr. Campbell, a surgeon who for some reason keeps getting him put a VR shit and who has a no-nonsense attitude and a way of doing things that clashes with the morals and priorities of most of the other characters. Though he is ultimately well-meaning, simply working from a different set of morals and priorities, he's often employed as something of an antagonist and is largely disliked by the other character. Notably, for the purposes of this discussion, he's disliked by Mario. Campbell ultimately takes Angus under his wing when Angus decides to switch his discipline to surgery, and Angus really admires Dr. Campbell too, emulating his behavior and trying to be as much like him as possible. And I love this as a direction. This is really interesting to me, and had the show lasted longer, they could have taken Angus's character in a really fascinating direction from here. While Mario develops by slowly becoming more open and critical of unsympathetic attitudes, Angus starts more like Mario was at the start of the show, a version of himself that Mario clearly doesn't like very much. And yes, when it comes to these two characters, I'm most interested in their relationship and how they relate to each other. Sue me. Genuinely, Angus's arc was getting really interesting there, one of the more interesting in the show, and I really do think this story's biggest weakness is that they didn't get to finish it. And as far as Code Black goes, that's a pretty good run, because to be honest, most of the character arcs are either so dull that I've forgotten them, or they've driven me absolutely insane. I'd also like to briefly mention Dr. Leanne Rorish. At the start of the show, we quickly learned that Leanne lost her husband and children in a car crash of which she was the only survivor. And over the course of the show, I think they do a pretty good job of exploring how she responds to her trauma and how it influences her decisions as she tries to move on with her life. And I'm being vague, but on purpose. I do think that Leanne has the best and most complete arc, and if you do want to watch the show, then it's the arc I want to leave unspoiled. I just want to point out that it's there, and I like it. You know, enough. Oh, and honorable mention, in season 3, they introduced a character named Diego, who, in the show, is the guy filming a documentary about the ER. And I'm not going to say much here, except that I do think it's interesting that Diego is consistently characterized as both a colossal douche and not very good at his job. And he has like one scene where he does something redeeming and acts like a human being. Decisions were made here. Decisions that if I liked the show more, I would be autistically obsessed with, but in like a good way, you know? Now, this is it. This is the part of the video that I really wanted to get to because I had to do it. I had to cleanse my soul. Have you ever watched a show and felt like the writers had a favorite character? Not necessarily a character who completely takes over and steals the show, a la Steve Urkel, but a character who the writers clearly like writing for and seem invested in at the expense of the other characters. In season 2 of Code Black, we're introduced to Ethan Willis, a military doctor who was temporarily working at Angel's Memorial. Ethan is an interesting character, you know, enough, but the trouble is that can be said for plenty of those characters. Not all, but plenty. And Ethan gets a little bit too much focus for my liking. Ethan's whole thing is that he's a soldier in a medical drama, so he's carrying a great deal of trauma that he channels into helping his patients, often taking huge risks in the process. Not like fall out over helicopter risks, but like, you know, walking into a collapsing haunted house risks. If you can imagine those two things on a scale of risk. Ethan is a fine character, and Rob Lowe does fine portraying him. Not only is his romantic relationship the only one that gets enough exploration to be in any way interesting, but as someone who's usually most compelled by stories about familial relationships in fiction, the time the show spends on Ethan mourning his late brother and what his brother's death has done to his relationship with his father is basically Kit Robinson catnip. Look, it isn't Ethan's fault. None of this is Ethan's fault. But in an ensemble show with no one protagonist, you'd expect to have different episodes focus on different characters. Maybe have a Mama episode, a Rorish episode, a Rowley episode if you're feeling artsy, or a Mario episode if you're looking for the best episode in the show. And while you do get these episodes, there's also always an Ethan-centric story to go along with it, which can get a little bit tiring. When it comes to character longevity, for a show with only 3 seasons, Code Black has a pretty high turnover rate, losing 2 members of its main cast at the end of season 1, with no acknowledgement, which feels weird, and more members of its main cast slowly over the course of season 2. Focusing so much on Ethan instead of the rest of the cast makes things feel a lot less cohesive than they could be. In season 3, Ethan goes on a ride-along with a paramedic named Rox, and it basically becomes his thing. He's obsessed with it. And from that point on, he and Rox essentially become partners. They take the ambulance out together and bond over their personal bullshit and fall in love, because of course they do. And basically what I'm describing here is the premise of a different show. And I'm not gonna lie, it's actually pretty annoying. Half of season 3 is taken up with whatever Ethan and Rox are doing, which is often so disconnected from the rest of the show that they don't even bring patients back to the hospital. And I honestly started to feel like I was losing my mind, because am I actually watching a completely different show? Is this like when my ADHD is so bad that I watch Bob's Burgers while watching a Markiplier video, except less interesting? And also I have to look at Rob Lowe. What are we doing here? Like, Code Black, I don't know if you were desperate for novelty or you couldn't get Rob Lowe in the same room as everyone else, but it's super weird to reel me in with a dramatic opening title about how often the ER is in Code Black and then immediately take me away from the ER in an ambulance with Rob Lowe. I feel like I've been catfished. Oh, and random note while we're here. In the scene where Ethan confesses his love to Rox, Mario also confesses his love to his girlfriend Noah. And I was so bored that I can't even be bothered to come up with an analogy to describe how bored I was. I have never been less inspired by a romance than I was by Mario and Noah's.
I lied.
I do always want to be as fair as I can, and I want to do the show justice. So let's take a quick look at a couple of the show's better episodes. One which seems to be pretty widely considered to be one of the show's best, and another that happens to be my personal favourite. First off, Season 2, Episode 30, titled Unfinished Business. At this point in the show, Dr. Rolly Guthrie is suffering from Parkinson's and is as such unable to practice medicine. He's offered an experimental treatment that might allow him to practice medicine again, but there's a short window to accept. He refuses the surgery and instead takes a job as the hospital chaplain, offering counsel and emotional support to patients and their families. I don't want to look at this one in too much detail. I don't think the crux of what makes it such a highly rated episode really hinges on the specifics of much of the story, if that makes sense. Indeed, most of the episode plays out as normal. The difference here, for most of the runtime, is that Rolly is unable to support patients by practicing medicine as is his instinct, to the point of having to watch on helplessly, knowing how to help, but being unable to do so. Instead, he takes on a different role, sitting with and supporting the patients, and while Rolly as a character is generally empathetic and into his patients as it is, here he leans especially into that role and really gets to know several patients. So you spend the episode also getting to know Rolly, who is often positioned as a mentor to the other characters, rather than a character explored in depth himself. Then, the reason that this episode is so highly rated. Right near the end of the episode, Rolly wakes up from surgery. It turns out that he, in fact, did accept the treatment, and the events of the episode they didn't really happen. And, okay, maybe a lifelong and pretty obsessive fan of Alice in Wonderland doesn't have a leg to stand on in criticizing the "it was a dream" trope, but let's just say that I understand if you're resistant. But here, the events of Rolly's dream sequence, let's say, are representative of events from Rolly's life. We spend the episode exploring his memories and those things which turned him into the man he is today. It's definitely the most artsy episode of Code Black. And to be honest, unless they absolutely butchered the premise, it was going to be among the most highly rated. I do like that it explored a character who had previously taken on a role as a mentor, an advisor. And Rolly also has a pretty major role in my favorite episode, which happens to be pretty Mario-centric. Mario Savetti, despite having not discussed him in much detail up until this point, actually my favorite character. I don't even know why. Maybe for queer reasons. I'm shallow like that. In this episode, Mario and Rolly, and also Angus, whatever, are treating a gay man named Ted who, as the show puts it, has been HIV positive since the Reagan administration.
You're a survivor.
I am nothing if not that.
At this point, Ted is pretty much all alone. All of his friends are either dead or live far away, and he's dying because his heart is giving out. Essentially, he's having this moment of dark victory in that he's lived long enough to die of something other than AIDS. So the episode does do the thing you'd expect an episode about someone HIV positive to do, and one of the doctors, Mario, gets stuck with a needle while drawing Ted's blood. Though, while Mario does wrestle with this briefly, it's less the focus of the episode and more a jumping off point for Mario and Ted to start talking and bond with one another. But, okay, so there's a sequence where Mario tells Ted that he got stuck with a needle, but his excuse is that he doesn't want to get a prescription to protect himself because the hospital will have to deal with a whole load of paperwork. Ted, as it turns out, sees a lot of himself in Mario and is eager to give him advice. You know, the young guys, when they're worried, they take the medicine. Just take the fucking medicine, he says. And Angus knows it's for Mario and is obviously concerned and reaches out to him, and Mario just basically yells at him. It makes you wonder why, at this point, Angus is so persistent in trying to befriend him, because he's consistently just a dick about everything. God, I love Mario. Yahoo! So, why is this episode my favorite, you ask? Yes, when conversing with Mario, Ted talks about growing up gay in Ohio, what it was like being a sexually active gay man in that era, and, you know, the lack of empathy people often have for that kind of thing. It's simple, but it's meaningful. Even as queer stories are becoming more readily available in media, there still seems to be an apparent reluctance to tell the stories of older and historical queer people, you know, without turning into victim porn. And especially if you're a young person who primarily gets to interact with the community through social media, that can obfuscate the discourse a little bit, contribute to a disregard for the lived experiences of older queer people. Ted is just a guy. He's an old guy who's sick and alone in the hospital. He's lost most of his friends, and he's wondering, when he's gone, who's going to feed his cat? And he might be alone, but he's not alone in having experienced something like this. Towards the end of the episode, Ted asks Mario to tell him a story about his life.
You don't know a thing about me.
Then tell me a story about you. Start with, I remember when. I remember trying pot for the first time. Coke. I remember the first time I kissed someone. I remember that time I saw Titanic. Ah, you did, didn't you?
I remember when they forgot me.
It being so early in the show, this is one of the first times we really see Mario come out of his shell and reveal so much of himself. He's a human being, what do you know? And I already said that this kind of episode done well is the best that Code Black has to offer. And for me, this really is the show's best example of a relatively simple story where two people have a meaningful, if short-lived, connection that influences one of the main characters enough that we see a small change in him by the end.
You shouldn't have died alone. He didn't.
And because it's the kind of thing that I think will come up, I don't think it takes away from the story that Mario isn't queer, because that's not really the point. While being gay is obviously a significant part of who Ted is, their connection is more about a shared feeling of being alone. And I personally think that in Mario, they picked the best character to explore here. Hey, remember when I said I wanted to make a pretty specific comparison to Grey's Anatomy? Okay, so I don't want to analyze the episode I'm about to discuss in too much detail. I'm also not accusing anyone of anything, so just keep that in mind. But I am going to talk about an episode of Grey's Anatomy and an episode of Code Black, and hopefully this will illustrate some of the differences in quality or otherwise, regardless of the way that Grey's Anatomy has itself varied in quality over the years. Okay, Grey's Anatomy. It's season 11, 2015. The episode is I Feel the Earth Move. An earthquake rattles Seattle. Owen, a character with whom I struggle, is working in the ER and receives a call from a little girl named Ruby, who's played by Millie Bobby Brown, a thing that I only bring up because I feel like if I don't, someone will yell at me. Essentially, Ruby's mother has collapsed, and it looks like she's not going to survive long enough for help to get there. So Owen and some of the other doctors stay on the call to help walk her through the steps needed to help her mother. Code Black, 2018. The season 3 episode, Cabin Pressure. Mario is doing something that they do occasionally in this show and is on the radio helping out emergency services when he is suddenly contacted by a little girl named Ruby. Ruby's mother has collapsed, and it looks like emergency services aren't going to be able to help her, so Mario and some of the other doctors stay on the call to help walk her through the steps needed to help her mother. I'm not going to call out the fact that these two episodes have such a similar premise. They're medical dramas, and medical dramas always tell, like, a bunch of the same stories. And I don't know if this is one of them, but I have a headache. And here we are. I've seen a lot of people say that I Feel the Earth Move is a pretty silly episode, but I think as far as Grey's Anatomy goes, it's pretty tame, so it's fine. I also think that there are some differences between it and Cabin Pressure that, to me, illustrate some of the issues with Code Black, and hopefully sharing them will do the same for you. In Grey's Anatomy, when guiding Ruby through helping her mom, they get her to cut her open, stick a little straw in there so she can breathe. And by the end, they've taught her how to do CPR. And Ruby is performing CPR when the cell phone runs out of battery. In Code Black, and this is the reason the episode is called Cabin Pressure, Ruby's mum is flying a plane, and they have to wake her up so she can land the plane. I don't know what it is with the show and planes, but it would save me a lot of trouble if everyone in this universe just had their pilot's license revoked. I'm not saying that nobody would ever collapse while flying a plane. There's a reason commercial flights have more than one person there who can fly the plane. I'm just saying, truth being stranger than fiction and all, you're going to have to do a lot to sell me on this. And you're going to have to not make it too silly. So yes, the difference in second Ruby's case is that her mum is a pilot and they urgently need to wake her up so she can land the plane. So they sort of, they ask what equipment Ruby has around her. You know, do you have a laptop with you? That kind of thing. And they sort of, they guide her through disassembling it so she can make a makeshift defibrillator. And it's not the biggest difference in the world, but I do think it's different than the other thing. Code Black is strange. Despite everything I discussed today, Code Black is so devoid of identity that I barely feel right defining it by its own quote-unquote gimmick. It isn't really a show about the busiest ER in America, a show about a hospital without the resources needed to treat its patients. It's a show where occasionally a character mentions or alludes to the fact that they're in Code Black, and where I'm assuming some producer somewhere forced the show to try to be something else, and then something else, and then something else over and over again until it was nothing. It's like watching a cover of your favorite medical drama. There is nothing about Code Black that I strongly dislike, but there's nothing about it that I love. While there are serviceable storylines and good relationships between the characters, there's also nothing that other shows vying for the same audience don't do better. There's little reason to watch Code Black if you are looking for a medical drama or a found family story, or for Rob Lowe to show up in like soft reboot. But that said, I did find reason to watch it. A few months ago, a particularly enjoyable combination of ADHD and depression rendered me incapable of functioning as well as a 6-year-old could if I didn't give my brain a good 3 or 4 hours to warm up. I wanted to watch a show that didn't require me to think too hard, and that I wouldn't have to engage with emotionally, and Code Black was perfect. And sure, that sounds insulting, but in a lot of ways, I don't think that Code Black was ever really trying to be something more than some colors and sounds that people would point their human eyes towards. And I also didn't really care about the discourse of having to switch your brain off. My brain was already off. It was gone. So I guess the conclusion is that I'm a fan of Code Black. I was happy enough watching it a second time to make notes, and I'll probably watch it again in the future. I have an attachment to this weird, non-committal show that I can't quite describe. You know, the truth is that there is a place for nothing content. Even if someone is just throwing stuff at the wall and never truly finding what it is they want to create, there may well be an audience that hopefully finds something in it that the creator did not.
You see, how fucking pretentious was that? Now that is how you waste a creative writing degree.